Good evening, everybody, and welcome to BrisScience, back once again in our wonderful virtual meeting room. I'm your host for this evening, Joel Gilmore, and you are, of course, signed into one of the BrisScience free monthly talks, where we bring not just the best scientists, but also the best communicators to share their passion and knowledge of science with a wonderful audience in Brisbane, and indeed now potentially the whole world. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today, on the many lands indeed, and pay my respect to elders both past and present. And I'd also like to, of course, thank the University of Queensland, who host this fantastic series and make it all possible. So tonight, even though we are in the middle of a pandemic, and hence our virtual series, it's easy to perhaps forget that there are other pressing issues that we need to tackle. And first and foremost of them, to my mind, is climate change and the environmental issues linked to it, meaning that tackling climate change can mean helping to preserve our environment. So tonight we are very lucky to have with us Professor Catherine Lovelock from the School of Biological Sciences at the University of Queensland. And Kath's research focuses on climate change and its impacts on coastal plant communities, and particularly the role of blue carbon dioxide that is currently stored in marine ecosystems where it needs to stay. So Kath is a member of the International Scientific Blue Carbon Working Group and leads Australian and international projects focused on climate change adaptation. So is definitely the perfect person to speak to us tonight. So please join me in giving a wonderful virtual welcome to another international expert on the Brisbane stage, Professor Kath Lovelock.
Hello everybody, good evening. It's a great pleasure to be with you tonight to talk about blue carbon. So I'm just going to share my screen with you and get going. So my title tonight is Blue Carbon. What is it, where is it, and why is it important? And I'm hoping that maybe you've heard the term blue carbon before. So in the broader sense, blue carbon describes all of the organic carbon that's bound up in the oceans. And it was a term coined in 2009 to really draw attention to the role that healthy ocean ecosystems have in controlling the CO2 in the atmosphere, which has been rising because of anthropogenic effects, mainly burning fossil fuel and land use change. So the intent of using the word blue carbon, or the words blue carbon, is to really kind of focus our attention on what we can do to conserve and restore marine ecosystems. So that's in the very broadest sense, but the discourse has really focused, or the blue carbon sort of effort has really focused on coastal wetland communities. And by coastal wetlands, I mean ecosystems like seagrass, mangroves, and saltmarshes, which are pictured here. So these are remarkable plant communities. These are plants that have a terrestrial origin, if you like, and they have invaded the seas. And by doing so, they've taken all of those compounds that terrestrial plants are made of, so lignin and cellulose and other things, and they're introducing those into these salty, saturated sediments or soils. And what that means is that over time, they're really high levels of productivity. You know, they grow quite rapidly in some cases, they sequester a lot of carbon, you know, they fix a lot of carbon in photosynthesis, and they contribute that organic matter not only to their biomass, but to the soils or the sediments. So that means over time, you have this sort of accumulation of organic matter in sediments, keeping up with sea level rise over the thousands of years to more recent, centuries and decades, right? So, and if you really look at these plants, you can see they're sort of like making this tangled web in the water column, or at least when the tides come in for salt marshes and mangroves, and all of that root material, all of that structure sort of slows the water volume down. So it slows the water down and particles in the water sink, right? So that could be sediment and it could be organic matter. And it's that also that process of trapping and accumulating thing that adds to the carbon stocks that are in these ecosystems and their high rates of carbon sequestration compared to other ecosystems. So these sort of specialized characteristics of these systems is what leads them to have sort of large stocks of organic carbon and also high rates of carbon sequestration in biomass and soils. So here's some examples. You might be sort of like thinking, oh gosh, she's bonkers, right? But here's some nice, if rather extreme examples. So this, we're looking at here the root mat of the seagrass systems in the Mediterranean Sea. So they actually have produced meters of carbon-rich peat over thousands of years. And this is a really huge carbon stock in that part of the world. We can look at things like this, and you can see the root systems of this is a mangrove, one of my favourite mangroves in the Daintree River in North Queensland. And you can see those outrageous root systems and all of that, you know, black sediment, you know, meters of it, which is a really large carbon store, as well as the trees themselves, right? And then, you know, this is an example from sites that I've worked in over a number of years from Belize. And this is where 10 meters of peat has grown up over the Holocene, so over the last 10,000 years as sea level has risen gradually until it's sort of stabilized. But this whole island, or this series of islands, are basically made out of the roots of red mangroves that have not decomposed. You know, these really sort of wet, salty soils, slow decomposition. And the material, they grow roots, the roots die, and they decompose very, very slowly. Okay, so that means on a per hectare basis, carbon stocks in coastal wetland ecosystems are higher than in many other ecosystems. And this plot I've got for you here has the average global carbon stock per hectare, that's on the y-axis, for a range of ecosystems. And that sort of tanny colour that you can see is the sediment or the soil carbon. And the first is salt marshes. The second is seagrass, has actually less carbon than mangroves and salt marshes, but there's a whole lot more seagrass than there is mangroves and salt marshes. And then that's compared to tropical evergreen forests and tropical peat swamp forests. So even those very carbon-rich terrestrial systems have generally less per hectare of carbon stocks than the coastal wetland systems. So what I'm getting at here is to try and sort of underscore that if we conserve these systems, we can reduce liberating all of that carbon that is within them to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. We want to stop that, right? Because that's causing problems. And that if we restore them, we might be able to, or we will be able to, help mitigate CO2 going into the atmosphere from other sources, right? So we can contribute, if we restore these systems, to carbon capture, right? Which is really, you know, one of our goals, because this is so important in order to hold the global temperature to, you know, the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, which is what we are, or which is what the global ambition is currently. So I first started to get involved in this research when I was in Belize, and you can see from this that mangrove fieldwork comes with its own fashion issues. But I was working on these mangroves in Belize, doing another project actually based on nutrient enrichment. And while we were there, this mangrove was illegally cleared. this happens because people want to build resorts. These are beautiful islands in the Mesoamerican Barrier Reef system. So they're often cleared, filled with sand, and then tourist resorts are built on them. But at that time, I was measuring carbon dioxide or carbon emissions from different sites in the mangrove and in response to nutrient enrichment. But once this happened, and we were so dismayed, that I decided that what I really needed to do was go out and measure what was happening when you destroy a mangrove. And so what I discovered by doing this is that the CO2 emissions from doing this are really large. So this was anticipated, but you actually can measure it. And then in addition to that, other studies have shown that when you clear these systems and all of that organic matter, that carbon-rich organic matter in the soils begins to decompose because the microbes are using it, and the roots die and decompose, and the biomass, the above ground parts are burned, that you have these huge carbon dioxide emissions, but what you also have is subsidence of the sediments. And this is troublesome for sea level rise, because of course it accelerates the actual experienced rate of sea level rise. So this is on this, you can see this bottom picture is a sort of stylized nature of this island that is made of this 10 meters of peat. And the reason why it's been stayed intact is because the vegetation is there contributing to the soil volume over time, allowing this island to stay in place. All right, so clearing and destroying these ecosystems has led to carbon dioxide emissions, and this has happened over the globe for these three systems, which is why we are so interested in conservation and restoration of these systems. So these are some of my favourite gloom and doom titles. Here we go. Mangrove forest, one of the world's threatened major tropical ecosystems, published in 2001, describing the loss of mangroves throughout Southeast Asia to shrimp aquaculture production. The accelerating loss of seagrasses across the globe, published in 2009 by some of our colleagues, and described how pretty much the reduction in water quality because of pollution from the land is threatening seagrass globally. And there are very high rates of loss documented. And then the final one, centuries of human-driven change in salt marsh ecosystems, which really describes, activities since the Romans of people basically impounding salt marshes and filling them or converting them to other uses, for example, grazing land or agriculture. Okay, so I thought I'd show you some pictures. The first one is a picture of mangrove clearing in Madagascar, where the mangroves are cut actually to provide timber for building, among other things. And you can see the loss of soil from around those standing stumps. The next image to your right is mangroves being cleared for aquaculture in Indonesia. And then on the bottom, and I'll show you some other slides, these are not just things happening in other places. Historically in Australia, we've seen a massive loss of coastal ecosystems. And this is just an example on the bottom. This is Victoria, where the nice salt marsh you can see on the right has been filled as a rubbish dump and then smoothed over, cleared, and is now a playing field. And that is a very common land conversion in urban areas of Australia. We've also in the north got hydrological modifications of the floodplains. This is a ponded pasture where the tide has been locked out and the saltwater wetlands has been converted into freshwater wetland to largely feed cattle into the dry season. And then this is a picture of what degraded seagrass meadow looks, that's covered with all sorts of algae, largely because of poor water quality. So too much nutrients not enough light for the seagrass, but really great for seaweeds to grow on them, and small micro seaweeds. So if you're interested in the state of play and what's happened to wetlands in Moreton Bay, then I would recommend that you have a look at this recent offering from Ian Tibbets and other colleagues who have basically done a state of the environment for Moreton Bay. This is it's a summary of some of the challenges in the region, but also some of the successes. So it's not all gloom and doom. There are some really wonderful stories about the environment of Moreton Bay in this book. It's free for download, and it has chapters on nearly all of the kind of biodiversity that you would see in Moreton Bay, but also covers many other issues, including industries that use the bay, the importance of Indigenous communities in the bay and their relationship to the bay and other things. So please have a look. I've put the links there. Okay, but we'll get back to this, the blue carbon story. We can resume our discussion of the negative nature of these kinds of changes. And we're not only really concerned about the negative nature in terms of the carbon dioxide emissions. Well, we are, but that's not the only concern that we have. The concerns about losses of these ecosystems is really a loss of a whole range of ecosystem services that they provide us. So they don't only provide us carbon sequestration services. Of course, they're, amazingly important for recreation. There's nearly always, if you go and search on the internet and say barramundi, you'll get 100 pictures of really happy people catching fish in mangrove creeks, throughout the north of Australia, right? They're important spiritually and culturally. In some nations, like we looked at Madagascar, they're incredibly important for timber and forest products. So not only timber, but also products like honey and thatch and sugar from the mangrove palm and so on. They support fisheries. There's almost a one-to-one link in terms of the area of mangrove and the area of fish productions, because they're nurseries and also they're so rich in material of things that fish and crustaceans and other things really like to eat. We've talked about their role in climate regulation, and I'm going to consider the coastal protection services especially in a moment, but they're also important for maintenance of water quality, and by that I mean that they trap sediments and they process nutrients. So in some places they're actually grown as nutrient treatment for their nutrient treatment services, right? I mean, not that I'm necessarily advocating that should occur, but they are very, very good at cycling nutrients, right? And can you imagine what has happened as the amount of nutrients that we're putting into our coastal systems has increased, and at the same time our extent of coastal wetlands has declined, right? It's almost like the double whammy, right? So keep that in mind as we go forward and we talk about the importance of conserving and restoring these systems and what it can deliver for our benefits, right? So the two things that I didn't cover in the last slide was that coastal wetlands contribute to adaptation to climate change. And this is becoming very important. And if you watch any news about when there's cyclones out on the Pacific Islands, if you've thought about what's happening in the Torres Strait and in other low-lying nations of the world, that you know that coastal wetlands have the capacity to protect infrastructure from the damages wrought about by cyclones, hurricanes, typhoons. So this is largely in the bucket that's called nature-based solutions, right? But it's all about reducing flood damage because coastal wetlands increase infiltration, they slow water flows, so they're really good for helping to control floods. This accumulation of material, whether it's sediment and organic matter, allows them to sort of keep up with sea level rise and thereby protect our coasts. They can self-repair, they can grow again, right? And under the right conditions, they are relatively self-sustaining. And then if you compare the coastal protection, the cost of coastal protection using coastal wetland plants as a part of the solution, compared to just laying more concrete, then there's lots of studies that would indicate that it's a more cost-effective measure. So it's cost-effective, we sequester carbon and we get fish, right? It's really almost a no-brainer. Yeah. So I wanted to share with you this lovely study, if you haven't been convinced sufficiently yet, and that is done by one of my colleagues, Edward Barbier, and he used the night lights. So from satellites, you can see the night, the lights of urban centres, or our lights that we have on at night. And this is actually an indication often of economic activity. So what he did was he looked at the change in luminosity in locations when they were struck by cyclones, in locations that had mangroves and those that didn't have mangroves, or had very little mangroves, that mangroves had been cleared. And what he found was that in places where there were intact mangroves, they basically suffered less economic damage from storms and they recovered more rapidly. So this graph shows the red one is the coastlines that have very few mangroves and the loss in economic activity after a storm. And the green one is when you have a mangrove, right? So the damage is less. And then the other part of this that I'm not showing you is that the recovery was more rapid. So, I mean, even if you're not really into coastal wetlands because they, are muddy and right? Even if you are really an economic rationalist, you would be attracted by the idea of reduced damage, because as soon as there's reduced damage, it also has ramifications for insurance and other factors. So here we go. What we know is that the degradation of blue carbon, so of coastal wetland systems, leads to greenhouse gas emissions, CO2, carbon dioxide emissions. So intact ecosystems, the carbon sinks. Degraded and converted systems become net sources. And not only that, sometimes the land, the new use for that land, rice agriculture, sugarcane, aquaculture, actually produces more greenhouse gas emissions. So for example, when you feed fish, you give rise to nitrous oxide emissions. If you grow rice, rice emits methane emissions, right? So there's lots of other greenhouse gases. So if we can, switch this back and reinstate coastal wetlands where we have unproductive agriculture, where we have disused aquaculture ponds, we're basically, we're not getting much out of what we're doing with them anyway. Let us turn them back into net carbon sinks and help with controlling or with mitigating CO2 that's going into the atmosphere. So we've got two options here. We can conserve, which means let's avoid the CO2 emissions associated with degradation. So that means we need to invest in things like marine protected areas, and we need to find ways where coastal wetlands are being overexploited to reduce the exploitation, so reduce the needs for those particular products. And we can also restore, right? And so I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about restoration of coastal ecosystems. So if we want to restore, that means we're basically going to recreate, we're going to not recreate the ecosystem as it was, because often that's not possible, but we're going to bring something back that has the same kinds of functions and restore the CO2 sink. Now, often I'm asked, how much would all this restoration and conservation of coastal ecos really contribute to reducing CO2 in the atmosphere? So we had a go at that for a report that we did for this, I don't know what to call it really, institution called the High Level Panel for a Sustainable Ocean Economy. It's a group of leaders, including our own Prime Minister is on it, who is interested in trying to support better management of the oceans, right? So as a chapter in that whole series of studies that were commissioned, we tried to work that out, and we estimated that of the amount of CO2 that needs to be sequestered to hold the global temperature to only a 1.5 degree increase, that all of the ocean options would probably contribute about 21%, about 20% to what's required, right? So we still need to reduce emissions, that says in our business as usual, and we still need to increase forest cover and other and explore technological options and other things to reducing CO2 in the atmosphere. But the ocean can contribute, through these things like ocean-based transport and renewable energy, about 20% of those needs. And then the coastal wetlands contribute only about, 10 to 15% of that, right? So actually quite small. And that means that only about 2 to 2.5% of the total global requirement, if we restored and conserved all of the coastal wetlands that we could, right? So it's actually quite small. It's a small contribution. However, it was still, in this analysis came out to be one of the most preferred options because of the provision of all those other ecosystem services that we get out of them, which I described earlier. The other thing is that although that's the global assessment, individual nations actually stand to gain more or less from blue carbon. So for example, if you're a country that has rather low emissions in, for example, industrial or transportation sectors, but you have a high level of opportunity in blue carbon because you have a lot of mangroves and you have a lot of seagrass, for example, then you would stand to benefit from pursuing blue carbon as a way to mitigate climate change. And those countries would be countries like Indonesia and Bangladesh and parts of Mexico, right? So, it really depends on the opportunity. But okay, you have to keep it in mind that this is not the silver bullet that can solve everybody's problems, but it is a part of the solution and a very valuable part because of the climate adaptation and other ecosystem services. So the question is, how are we going to make this happen? And I had this, I've been involved in, I'm sure many of you have too, this sort of theory of change where you, set out this very logical sequence of events that will get you to where you want to go. But the truth is with blue carbon, it's been very, very complicated. We have a whole range of things that we need to make it happen. We need government, industry and community support. We need finance and we need science, right? It all sort of has to come together. So, rather than this linear sequence, I'm afraid the reality is that it's more like a very tangled mangrove root system that you have to get through, right? But I want to describe briefly some of the things that are happening on the international stage to make blue carbon, conservation and restoration of coastal wetlands for their carbon benefits reality, right? And one of the first and big things that's happened is that the International Panel for Climate Change released guidance on how to account for the losses and gains of blue carbon ecosystems in your national greenhouse gas accounts. Now, why that is so important is because before we couldn't do that. So there was no real incentives for governments to embark upon such projects, or financing or supporting those kinds of projects, right, that would restore and conserve wetlands. But all of a sudden now, coastal wetlands, if you knock a whole bunch of them down, then somebody in Canberra is looking to say, okay, that is a plus on our emissions. And if you restore a whole bunch, they're looking to say, okay, now that's a minus on our emissions. Good, right? So blue carbon systems, because of that guidance, blue carbon ecosystems are beginning to be included in countries' nationally determined contributions, which are the statements that nations make to say how they're going to mitigate climate change, right? How are they going to mitigate and adapt? So, for example, in that bottom right, you can see a map, and these are countries that have committed in 2016, by 2016, to including coastal wetlands in their greenhouse gas accounts. And there are more who are interested and who are trying to work out how they can do it. So in addition to that sort of international government, national government level, there's also carbon market methodologies that are developing. So one there I put there is one through the Verified Carbon Standard, which provides guidance, it provides instructions really on how you go about doing a project that would get you carbon credits that you could sell to generate finance for your conservation and restoration activities, right? So unfortunately in Australia, we can't participate in the VCS, but the Emission Reduction Fund has started to develop a blue carbon methodology, which hopefully will be available in the next couple of years, which will provide opportunities for Australian landholders to undertake blue carbon projects to generate Australian carbon credit units. Okay, so in addition to that sort of action, there's also just a whole lot of enthusiasm and energy in the international communities that are devoted to coastal wetlands. And these include Blue Carbon Initiative, International Partnership for Blue Carbon, the Global Mangrove Alliance, and I realise I've been talking too long here. There's also internationally a really new energy for restoration, and this is going to be marked by the UN Decade of Restoration, which starts next year. And certainly coastal wetlands then are going to be an important part of this sort of initiative. But there are lots of challenges, and I really don't want to spend too much time going through them because I'm running short on time. But what we want to do is design projects that are good for communities. And with that in mind, we have to make sure that communities still get what they want out of coastal wetlands. This is wood being sold in Myanmar. And of course, communities want to fish, so we can't do projects that lock up coastal wetlands so nobody can go in them. Right. So there are good carbon projects out there in the world. This one is Mikoko Pomojo. It is done under Plan Vivo. And this community in Kenya has restored and looks after about 100 hectares, and they receive about 10,000 a year to support their community activities from doing that. In Queensland, things are happening. The Land Restoration Fund of the Queensland government is basically doing pilot projects to try and help us through some of the spaghetti of how to do blue carbon projects in Australia. They're interested in carbon projects that deliver environmental and economic co-benefits for landholders. And there's a beautiful project that you could look up, the Blue Heart project in Sunshine Coast, which is a conglomerate to generate a whole bunch of ecosystem services. And this is also a pilot blue carbon project. It's about 1,000 hectares currently of restoring wetlands. So just to conclude, and I'm happy to answer questions on some of those projects if you have them, that blue carbons in the oceans and on coasts, we focus on coasts because they have large carbon stocks and they've been damaged and destroyed, but we can effectively manage them to enhance carbon sequestration and to deliver other ecosystem services. And that restoration and conservation of coastal wetlands is really going to increase coastal resilience globally. And with that, Joel, I'm finishing up. I'm stopping sharing my screen and I'm flipping back to you.
Fantastic, Kath. Thank you for a both inspiring and concerning look at an issue perhaps that we doesn't come to attention compared to some of the other big ticket items you hear about, like renewables or energy. So we've already got a few questions coming through. Let's go to those if you're happy to take a few questions, Kath.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so the first question we have is, how can we better align the interests of recreational users and environmentalists? So I'm thinking this might be in response to your comments around like barramundi fishes and so forth. And
Yes, well, I think actually we environmentalists and people who want to use the environment are actually should be better friends, right? So I think it's about really demonstrating the benefits of these sort of restoration and conservation activities for everybody. And I really think it's about project design, right? You know, if you go, for example, I work in Myanmar. If we go and do a project that says we're going to restore this stuff and now we're going to lock everybody out, we will absolutely drop, you know, we'll get ourselves kicked out of there quick time, right? Because people want access to those resources. So it really behooves us to make projects and management decisions that kind of can support dual use, you know? And I think that's one of the big challenges, you know, for conservation, is finding that balance, right? But you know, the truth is, if we have more coastal wetlands in North Queensland, we're going to have more barramundi. You know, that's the way it's going to work.
Thank you. Got a question from Brian, who asks, what sort of time frame is required to regain those significant depths of carbon-rich soils?
In some instances, it's really thousands of years. I hate to tell you that, you know. But in other instances, you can see that that sediments and carbon-rich sediments accumulate actually quite quickly. So, you know, I've been looking at a few papers recently, and they're like talking about centimetres of sediment being deposited per year, right? So it really is a little bit dependent on the level of inundation. And so you've got to get a sweet spot when you do restoration, not so deep that the plants can't survive and they suffer, not so high in the intertidal that they rarely get inundated, because then they can't grow and there's no sediment trapping and very little organic matter kind of deposited. So there's an element of finding the sweet spot, but it can happen over decades, right? So it takes about 2 decades to regrow a mangrove forest, and you can be thinking that it will be accumulating maybe anywhere between 3 mils and 10 mils a year. So about, you know, between 0.3 and 1 centimetre a year.
So it is the sort of thing where you're going to be able to see improvements within your lifetime, at least in some cases.
Oh man,
if people, you know, even if politicians get behind this, they might actually be able to point to it. And
yeah, you can see results really quite quickly, I think. You know, like if you've been watching the Blue Heart site, if you've been watching other sort of restoration sites, you know, there's a beautiful one in Brisbane done by the B4C, the Bulimba Creek restoration. They've done a restoration in Bulimba Creek, the Bulimba Creek Oxbow, and honestly, the trees are indistinguishable almost from the sort of something that is natural, and it took about 15 years.
I think that's a really great positive story to take away for people, perhaps when we're communicating with our local members in next conversations. Question from Tamara, apologies. Are there areas, and follow on perhaps from your comment about Bulimba Creek, are there areas in the Moreton Bay region that can benefit from a restoration program?
Yes, there are degraded wetlands in this in Moreton Bay, and there are also areas that I would say that we need to conserve for future wetlands. So, all over, we've lost 50% of the salt marshes in Moreton Bay to industrial, urban, just sort of development, right? So I think there really needs to be a big kind of like look at where we might be able to restore salt marshes particularly. The mangroves are actually doing pretty well in Moreton Bay, and that's largely because we've got a whole lot of sediment that's come down, over the last century that they've occupied. So I think sites can be found to restore wetlands, and groups like B4C are really on the forefront of that. The Oxley Common is another great example.
Fantastic. I've got time for one more question. And this is from Nicole, who says, Kath, a really wonderful and accessible presentation. If you had to list off the 3 most important research priorities or knowledge gaps in blue carbon and wetland systems, what would they be? And I feel this is a very pertinent question given, Kath, I understand you've just been named a 2020 Australian Laureate Fellow and received the Georgina Sweet Australian Laureate Fellowship. Is that correct?
That is correct. I am very grateful and happy to have been received that award. I tell you, one of the first things I would say is that to make blue carbon projects happen, we really have to reduce uncertainty for people who want to do projects. And one of the key uncertainties is what will happen with climate change. So that's a big one, because why would we invest in conservation and restoration if they're all going to be drowned by sea level rise, for example? So I think that's an important set of, that's not just one research question, that's just a whole load of stuff to think about. And then probably one of the other ones or one of the other things that I think about a lot is this sort of nexus between science and making things happen, right? Because sometimes we do science, but it's not really applicable. And so one of the things that I really want to look at is how to enable site selection and understanding how sites are going to behave when you do restoration projects. And so a lot of that is making, understanding the hydrology of wetlands and how it interacts with carbon sequestration, right? So that's another one of the kinds of things that I'm going to be doing over the next 5 years.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for a bit of insight into what we can see next, and maybe we'll look forward to your updated BrisScience talk in a few years, where you give us some more good news, I hope.
Well, I'm really hoping that the restoration projects that are funded by the under the Land Restoration Fund, that they will deliver some good benefits. We've already had some desktop studies that have looked at where in Queensland some of the most sort of like productive blue carbon projects might occur. And then I think there's a whole lot to be talked about, what's happening in South Australia and what's happening in Victoria and what's happening in Tasmania. Oh my Lord, people are busy. It's a really busy space, and there's, I think there's going to be a lot of exciting things, exciting results, and, like things to make us feel like coastal ecosystems are on the improve.
That's fantastic. And, a good call to action for everybody to keep your mind looking to the future and to some of these long-term projects. So thank you so much for your time this evening, Kath. That was a fantastic talk and a lot of insight into an area that I knew relatively little about. So the comments that have come through and some of the comment questions have been very, thanking you for a fantastic talk and enjoyable presentation. So I'm sure the rest of BrisScience agrees. Make sure everybody you follow our mailing list to sign up for our next talk, and watch this space. Don't forget you can catch this talk on YouTube in a few days as well.